Before we go any further with our compositional layout, I want to turn our attention back on our view controller and talk about the diffable data source that we can use with collection views. Now this changes again how we use our collection view and how we tell it what its data is. And this is an important part of how you would deal with situations where you have new data coming in and you want to animate that change. Or you have data that might have been deleted and you need to animate the deletion of those changes. And historically, this has been sort of a difficult problem. You basically have to reconcile the state and keep it synchronized, the UI state and the model state. And with diffable data sources and diffable data source snapshots, this is way easier than it used to be. So what we're going to do is right here next to our collection view, we're going to create a data source, which is a UI collection view diffable data source. Now, UI collection view diffable data source is generic over two things. The first thing is the type of section that we're using. And if you want to, you can just use an int so that you have numbered sections. And the second thing is the type of data that you're going to have in your collection view. So in this case, episode. We'll make that an implicitly unwrapped optional, and we will set it up right here. Data source equals UI collection view diffable data source. Now here we pass in the collection view that we're going to be using. So we actually need to move this down. And then a cell provider here, which is a method that takes the collection view, the index path, and the model. So what's nice about this is we can just return collection view .dq configured reusable cell using our featured episode cell registration for that index path and that model. So it's actually quite similar to what we already have. And because we only have one registration and we configured the data source right in here, we actually don't need to keep a reference to it here in the class anymore because it is just used in this one place. So we can now just say let featured episode cell registration. This is how we configure the featured cells. And for our data source, we can DQ the configured reusable cell using that same registration. Now here, I need to restore the type of data because we eliminated that from our class definition. So this is going to be featured episode cell and episode as the data model. So now moving down to our collection view data source, we can actually completely delete this section of code. Our view controller is no longer going to be the data source. Instead, we're going to pass in data source as the collection view's data source. And actually, this line of code is unnecessary because when you configure the data source, it will set the data source to the diffable data source for you. So I just need to delete that line of code. Okay, so now you must be asking, we've configured this data source, but we haven't told it how to deal with the data. How do we tell it how many sections there are? How do we tell it how many rows in each section? So we do that with something called snapshots. So I'm going to create another function here called private func update snapshot. And here I can create a snapshot, which is a NS diffable data source snapshot. Now again, this is going to be generic over the type of section we have and the type of model we're using. Then we can say that we have a section. We're just going to call it 0 for now. And then snapshot.append items. And those are an array of episodes. So I can get that straight from dataloader.episodes. This is a struct, so we need this to be var. So now I've appended these sections, in this case just one, and appended items to that last section. Now I can tell our data source to apply this snapshot. So instead of reload data here, I can now call self update snapshot. And everything still works. So we have a single section. It knows how many items are in the section because they're in the snapshot. The only real requirement that we have to do is our model has to be hashable. And it does this because what ends up happening is we'll have two different snapshots. Say we fetch some new data, we load up a new snapshot, and then we apply it, and the collection view data source can say, what has changed between the previous state and the new state. It can do that efficiently because our models are hashable. And it does that, and then it knows exactly whether it needs to insert rows, whether it needs to delete rows or reorder rows, and it can do all of that with an animation. So this is really powerful stuff, but I'm not happy with this integer here. This seems a little bit strange because I want to show featured episodes in the list, not all the episodes, and I want to be able to say that this is a featured section. So what I'm going to do here is in our view controller, I'm going to create an enumeration called section. It's going to be backed by an integer, and it will be case iterable so that we can count them. So now I can say that we have a featured section, and maybe we also have a recent section. So over here, I can say snapshot.append items, and I can say, let's snapshot.append sections rather, and we will say section.allcases. And now instead of the int, I can use my section data type. So we'll change it there, and we'll also change it up here where we declared our diffable data source. So now I've appended all of the sections. Now when I'm saying snapshot.append items, I can append items specifically to one section. So maybe I want to take data loader.episodes and maybe just take the first 10 of those, converting that back to an array, and put those in the featured section. Now the second section is not going to have any items in it anyway, so we can just ignore that for now. And now we see that we've got only 10 items in this first section. Okay, so what I want to do now is take the next section will be a recent list, and we're going to put probably 30 subsequent episodes in the recent list. And we're going to do it kind of like the App Store where we have like stacked groups of 3. So to do that, we're going to go over to our layout manager, and this is only describing a single section. In fact, this entire thing right here could be refactored. We're going to say refactor, and it doesn't want to refactor, so I'm just going to cut and paste. This is going to be func create featured section. And this will return an NS collection layout section, and we'll return it like this. So that way we can have our featured section sort of as isolated from the rest of the layout. Now you can see here that it's trying to be implemented with just a single section, but we want multiple sections now. So we're going to use a different initializer here. And the compositional layout takes a section provider, and this is something that gives us the section index and a layout environment to use. Now the layout environment is actually really useful because this gives us the option to investigate our trait collection or our container's content size or content insets in order to determine maybe this is a wide layout and we have enough room for 4 columns versus 3, to change things based on compact or regular width for iPad layouts, etc. So we'll be using that in a little bit. But for right now, I just need to know which section index we are and what section I need to return from this method. So I can say switch, and I can say section. Actually, this is a view controller.section, and then initialize that with the raw value of section index. Now, I actually just want to say guard let section kind is this. And if it's not there, I'm going to say fatal error, undefined section for value, and then pass in that section index. So if we ever get into this state, it's going to give us a friendly sort of warning there. Then I can switch on the section kind. And in the case of featured, we can return create featured section. Now in the case of recent, now we need to return create recent section, which is the method that I'll create right now. Create recent section is an NS collection layout section. We're going to have the item size is an NS collection layout size. And again, we're going to let the group determine the size of this thing. So the fractional width here will be 1.0, so full width of the group. But the height dimension, because I want 3 items in here, I'm going to use fractional height here of 0.3. So it sort of divides up the space in thirds and gives a third to each one of the items. So then our item is an NS collection layout item with that item size. Then we need our group size, which is an NS collection layout size. Here we can say that we want a fractional width, and we can determine what we want to do here. I actually want to do something similar where we can actually see the first group, and then we can see the second group poking out. So maybe we want to use a 0.8 here or 0.85. And then the height dimension for our group, this is going to be determined basically how high do we want each one of our item sizes to be, how high should the section be. And I think I want this to be something similar to the size of this thing. So I'm going to say that this is an absolute size of 240 points. So that'll give a 240 point tall section here, and it'll divide up that space into thirds to give room for each one of the cells that we're going to put inside of there. So now we can create our group, which will be an NS collection layout group. And this time we want vertical, and we want to specify which sub-item and how many there are. We'll use our group size. Sub-item will be item, and count will be 3. Then we can let the section be NS collection layout section, passing in this group, and then return it. Okay, so now we have a layout that describes multiple sections, and we need to give it some data to use. So we're going to go back to our view controller, and here we're updating our snapshot. This section right here, this is where probably a view model would be a good idea. But we can have, let's just say, an inner struct that we can call grouping. It takes in an array of episodes, and then we can have some computed properties for the featured, which will be an array of episodes, and recent, which will be an array of episodes, and then finally the remaining, which will be an array of episodes. So for the featured, maybe we say if the episodes.count is greater than 10, then we'll return an array with episodes prefixed for 10. Otherwise, we'll return an empty array because there's not enough to feature. For the recent, we essentially want to take the next 30-ish episodes. So we're going to say if the episodes.count is greater than 30, actually we want to do greater than 40 because we need to account for that. So we're going to return an array of episodes, and here we can say suffix from and take the number of featured episodes, which was 10, and then prefix the next 30. So we're sort of, we're safe here because we're checking the count to make sure we have enough to do this. And if we don't have enough to do this, then I'm going to return an empty array. And now here for the remaining, I basically just need to know how many I started with for featured and recent. So let used count is featured.count plus recent.count, and then we will return, let's see, check to see if the array.count is greater than the used count. And if so, I can return an array with episodes suffix from the used count. And that will give us the remaining episodes in that array. Otherwise, just return an empty array. Okay, so there's probably better ways to do this. Obviously, we're using featured and recent, and it's going to compute this multiple times, but this will be fast enough. And so this gives us a grouping class that we can use. And now I can say let grouping equals grouping of episodes. That's data loader.episodes. Now this guy can add the grouping .featured to the section featured. And we can do the same thing now, append items, grouping .recent to the section recent. Then apply the snapshot. Okay, so one thing we haven't done yet is tell it to use a different type of cell. We've just told it to use the featured cell. So this is where we can inspect that indexPath.section. So here I'm going to say guard let section kind is equal to section with the indexPath.section passed in. And if we didn't get one of those, then again, fatal error, unhandled section, and pass in the indexPath.section so that we can find and fix this quickly. Then we can switch on the section kind. And in the case of featured, we're going to do this. Okay, but we have another type of cell. And so we actually need to create the episode cell registration, which is essentially going to be this exact same thing because our cells look so similar, with the exception being that this is going to be episode cell. So again, I kept these separate so that we have the flexibility to treat them differently if we want to, but right now they're going to be pretty much the same. So now I can copy this code and say for the recent section, we're going to use the episode cell registration. So this will give us different cells for the second type. And I'm missing some colons here. So now we're building. Let's give this a run. Okay, so we've got our top section, and then we've got episode cells. And we said that we wanted these in groups of 3, and it's actually doing that. 1, 2, 3, and then it repeats it. 1, 2, 3. So, the grouping being in 3s, but we didn't tell it we wanted to scroll. So let's go back over to our layout manager. In the recent section, section.orthogonal scrolling behavior is group paging. And in this case, I think that because these are left aligned, the group paging will be better than centered because there's nothing to sort of anchor it on the left and right edges like there is for the featured section. So now we have 2 different sections, this one being scrolled, which gives you a quick list of some of the recent episodes. And then once you've exhausted this list, we may have a separate list down at the very bottom.